Reading is just a habit you gotta form in all life. Books don't change people's sentences.
Reading good, solid, reformed, Puritan literature, reading especially the classics, that's had the biggest impact on my life.
Well, g'day and welcome to another episode of the Reformers Bookcast, a podcast hosted by Reformers Bookshop. My name is Tom Eglinton, the manager here at Reformers, and today we are joined all the way from the UK by Glen Scrivener. Thanks for joining us, Glen.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom.
And Glen, could you introduce yourself for those of our listeners out there who might not know of you?
Very good. Well, I'm actually a Canberra boy to begin with, and grew up there until I was about 15, and then went to Wales, and then England, and then Sydney, and then London, and then Canberra, and then London, and now Eastbourne. Give or take the odd deportation. I've now been in the UK for more than half my life, and I am an ordained Church of England minister. And my day job is as an evangelist directing Speak Life, which is an evangelistic ministry based on the south coast of England, but broadcasting to the world and doing mission all over the UK and further afield.
Wow. What were a lot of those moves about? Because that was more moves than normal in a human life.
Well, if you're from Canberra, guess what my dad did for a living? He worked for the government, and so he was working in the public service there, and he got a job in the civil service in the UK, and so we switched hemispheres with not very much notice, and then it was only going to be for 9 months, but I ended up finishing off my schooling in England, and then I was going to go back to Australia, but I stayed on for uni in England. And then I decided to go back to Sydney to figure out, am I Australian, am I English, where do I want to live? And then I got a job back in London working for All Souls Langham Place. And so that took me back to London. And then I got deported, which took me back to Canberra. And
I really want to ask you about that, but maybe I shouldn't.
Oh, man. I mean, every Australian living overseas for some length of time has this kind of a story. The Home Office catches up with you at some stage. And I was told that I had to leave with 7 days notice or face £10,000 fine and 6 months in prison. So I thought,
yep, get out of there.
Best to leave. But then I sort of was getting together with my now wife, and she's from Northern Ireland. And so, yes, came back into the country. And now we live in England, which my wife thinks is halfway. So that shows you how compromise works in our marriage.
Oh, that's good. Now tell me about Speak Life, because that's where I've seen you before. I've seen some of your poetry and videos that you put out on YouTube. What's Speak Life all about?
It began life as there was an evangelistic charity that was going on before I joined, but we rebranded in 2015 when I started to direct the charity, and it's always been about proclamation, evangelism, and media. Back in the day, it started in the 50s, and its founder was into sort of the Crusades thing in that 20th century sense. We might think about the 12th century sense later on, but he was very much doing the Billy Graham thing and the radio program, and written into the fabric of the organization has always been proclamation and media. The media's changed a bit, and the proclamation involves a lot more church-based missions and uni camp that I reach out on. But yeah, trying to make a noise for Jesus on social media and making lots of videos and things. And we've got a training course, which is open to people from around the world that people come to for 10 months. You can be an intern here at Speak Life, and we go on mission together. We make media together. We learn about Jesus, get a theology of life and mission. So it's a lot of fun.
That's great. And have you always been a poet?
I think when I first moved to Wales, in fact, the first poem I can remember, I guess I was nearly 15 years old, and I wrote Yogurt, Vitamin, Scones as this song about accents. So I think I can still remember. It was Yogurt, Vitamin, Scones, Yogurt, Vitamin, Scones. The ways of saying these words are obeying. Rules of expanding your cultural standing. You're making a case for social debase by cruelly denouncing the ways of pronouncing yogurt, vitamins, scones. So that's where it all started.
That is great. Now, we've got a lot to talk about, so let's get into it. Okay. You have written this book. It's a new book, just come out in around the world, The Air We Breathe, How We All Came to Believe in Freedom, Kindness, Progress, and Equality. And before we get into the detail of the book, can you tell us sort of how did this book come about? Who did you have in mind when you were writing this? Why did you write it?
So in the beginning, I talk about 3 different audiences, and it's a bit greedy. Like marketers tell you can only have one audience. And I've basically said, my book is for everyone, because my book is for the nuns, the duns, and the ones. The nuns, the NONESs, those who say, what is your religious affiliation? They say none on a census form. The duns are those who are done with Christianity, been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, no thanks. And the ones are those who have already been won by Jesus. So in that, I've basically said it's for everybody. But the people that I've had in mind, in terms of the nuns, I do think quite often about a friend who once wrote a letter to me that said, of course you realize, Glenn, I could never be a person of faith. And it just seemed to her completely constitutionally impossible for her to believe. Believe is something that other people do. Faith is like midichlorians in Jedi blood. It's something that some people, they hit the jackpot and they get it, and some people they don't. And she just could not conceive of herself as being a believer. So I very much had her in mind, wanting to say to her, you already believe in a whole pile of nonsense. Like if you believe in human rights and human equality and compassion and all these things. So I wanted to write to her to convince her that she is already a believer. I also wanted to write to the Duns, my father-in-law. I bought him Tom Holland's book, Dominion, which is a big fat, book of history.
I bought it immediately after reading your book.
He will be so pleased. He wrote a little commendation for the book, and he's quite cheeky in his self-promotion. So I was quite expecting him to say, the air we breathe is a lovely little entree for those who want the main course of Dominion. So this is Dominion. My book is Dominion for Dummies, and I'm the dummy. But
sorry, you bought your father-in-law.
I bought my father-in-law Dominion back for Christmas 2019. It was even signed by Tom Holland, and I thought this will be a great way of engaging him with Christianity again, because he has very much been a sort of a done with Christianity, and it rested on his shelf unread, and I thought I'd love to press into his hands a book that he will crack the spine open and dive into. And then in terms of the ones, like I really want Christians to be excited about the fact that the gates of hell really will not prevail against the church. The church is prevailing against the gates of hell. And let's chart that over the last 2,000 years.
Yeah, and that's what you do. And the book is a couple hundred pages, but the scope is mammoth. You take us from early church all the way through to sort of 1900s. Even today, you reference Jordan Peterson and Black Lives Matter and all that sort of thing. And so it's quite phenomenal in its breadth. So well done. But I actually want
some detail gets missed,
just a little. But I actually wanted to start at the end because the essential premise of your book is that there are 7 virtues that you pick up on. I'm sure there's more, but 7 that you've picked up on that are assumed by everyone in the West to be true, to be relevant. Equality, consent, things like this. And what I thought interesting as I was reading was that the last one, progress. I think that was the last one.
Yep.
This idea that the arc of history, it will always go forward.
Bends towards justice. Yeah,
that's the quote you have. Yes, I thought that was interesting because as a Christian, or as anyone holding these values that we have here, nobody lives up to them, and so, I thought, what's the point of having an ideal of equality or compassion if none of us can live up to it? And so, what is it about progress, and what is it about how the gospel brings these values to us that means that they're actually worth believing in, and it doesn't just end up in this depressing pit of self-despair?
Despair, but self-righteous despair.
Yes.
Because the other guy is doing worse at the equality and compassion thing than I am. So, and that's the place where we're at. And Dostoevsky said 150 years ago that without God everything is permitted. But I think what we're noticing in sort of 2022 is that without God everything is preachy, really, really preachy, even more preachy than it was.
What do you mean by that? Just Explain that.
We have such moral certitudes. It's not that getting rid of God has gotten rid of humanistic values. We've kept those. We've kept the values of the kingdom, and we've spurned the king. And for those on the video, you've just seen Thomas Thorogood, who's just brought me a coffee. Thank you, Thomas. So we've kept the values of the kingdom. We've spurned the king. And now what do we have? We just have culture wars. Yeah. And culture wars are just, we're hurling Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the references. And they're incredibly spicy. And we're declaring one another to be heretics. And we're canceling one another, which is a form of excommunication. And it's all incredibly religious, but there is no forgiveness. So what we've traded, when we've traded, the values of the kingdom for, instead of having the king, we've now got the values of the kingdom. What we've lost is the king above those values that embodies compassion. He is compassion himself. And we've lost anybody who can forgive us. So you're absolutely right that it's one thing to hold to the values of equality and compassion. It's a very different thing to live them out day by day. And my first thing is just to say to the nuns of this world who say, I could not possibly believe, is to point to the moral certitudes that they hold and they think of these things as obvious, natural, and universal. And they are so contingent. They so obviously might not have been. Certainly, if we are just biological survival machines, these things certainly might not have been. And yet all my friends hold to these things. So step one is to say, we have these values, these assumptions, these gut instincts, these moral intuitions. And we try to live by them more than the other story that we live by, because the other story that we live by is that we are a biological survival machine. I'm just a wet robot. I'm just a DNA replicator. But we don't live, we certainly don't live day by day, and we don't navigate our lives according to that map of the terrain. Yeah.
Instead, like you're saying, we have moral outrage and things like this.
Yes.
About stuff that happens.
Right. So tap in, pull at the thread of that moral outrage, because at the other end of it is not a story about how we're just hurtling through a meaningless universe towards eternal extinction. At the other end of that thread is a person whose name is Jesus, and you really ought to get to know him, because he embodies those values above, and he is also beneath you with everlasting arms of forgiveness. Really the world is crying out for forgiveness right now, because we have the moral certainties. We just don't know what to do once we get cancelled. We don't know what to do once we're on the wrong end of the social justice tidal wave that is coming for us. So forgiveness has got to be at the heart of things. And I mentioned C.H. Spurgeon, who has a great line about individual Christians. He says, if you're semi-Christianity is the worst thing in the world. If you are only a half Christian, you're the most miserable creature in the world, because you have all law and no grace. Yep. You have the values of the kingdom and not the king himself. And I think as a culture, we've arrived there. We've got a kind of a semi-Christianity that has all sorts of certitudes and no means of reconciliation or redemption. And that's a pretty hellish place to be.
And it's almost like the only option there is if you have this moral outrage at what's going on out there, and then inevitably that moral outrage turns on you. What I'm doing is wrong. I've offended some friend or something like that. The only real option, if you don't have Christ, if you don't have the forgiveness that he offers, and then the grace that he offers to grow, is to double down.
Right.
No, I am right, and in that way, it seems to me like all these Christian values get distorted as we seek to double down on them.
Yes.
And prove that we're right, even in our imperfect moral outrage.
Yes. We've disconnected them from their source. We've distorted them. But they are still recognizably Christian. And so, or at least Christianish in their source, or at least in the way that we present them to the world. So I have a section on even like trans rights ideology, that the first three values of my book are equality, compassion, and consent. And what we've done with equality is disconnected it from its source in the gospel. And now we're prizing the individual. With compassion, we've divorced it from its story and we're into competitive victimhood.
So we want to become the focus of the compassion rather than Jesus painting us as you need to be the good Samaritan. We're like, no, we want to be the guy on the side of the road.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Instead of wanting to help the victim, we want to be the victim.
Yeah.
And it becomes competitive. It's the oppression Olympics and all that. And then on consent, we've divorced it from its much richer narrative of where sex belongs. And we've taken one aspect of a healthy vision for sex and relationships, consent, and we've made that into the thing.
Yep.
So that my choices in the sexual arena are God. Yes. Now combine those three things now, and you've got, I'm an individual. There is a certain cachet to being a minority, and a sexual minority that I have chosen is kind of the top of the hierarchy of those minorities. Combine all those three things, and you get something like trans rights ideology. Yep. Now that's not what Scripture teaches. On page 1 of the Bible, we've got male and female, and the story rolls on from there. But where we've gotten to is unimaginable without the Christian Revolution. And people are still using some very basic Christian tools and repurposing them within the culture wars. But the tools that they are laying hold of have their origins in the Jesus Revolution.
Yeah. Now, all of these virtues that come out of Christianity that you talk about in the book, no Christian lives up to them. And yet every Christian presents them as something that we should achieve, we should be, or we should strive for. And you address this question in multiple different ways throughout the book, but I can put it this way. What do you say to people when they come up to you and say, well, you tell me to be compassionate, but you're not compassionate. And so, you're a terrible person because you're not living up to this virtue.
Yes. And I think it happens usually the other way around. Usually it happens first with them saying, well, you, Glen, as a Christian are. And what's fascinating, the 7 values that I've identified are equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. And it's fascinating. Just reverse those 7 values and you've got, inequality, you've got cruelty, you've got coercion, you've got lack of enlightenment, darkness. You've got anti-science. You've got restrictive, and you've got regressive. Now, sounds like the church, right?
Well, it sounds like what people paint the church as. That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. That's that you've just described the worst thing in the world. If you've described something as unequal, cruel, non-consensual, darkened, anti-science, regressive, and restrictive, that is the worst thing in the world, and it's what Christianity is apparently in the popular discourse. Yeah. Well, the revolution rolls on. And people want to take some of the values of the revolution and apply it to their parents, and that's what always happens in revolutions. At some point, you turn on your parents and call them the regressive ones, and the children of the Christian Revolution are turning on their parents. But the first thing I want to do is make them notice what is the standard here. By what standard are we? Who said we were meant to be equal and compassionate? Jesus did, and I believe that we ought to be, but by what standard do you say we ought to be equal and compassionate? And so I think the first move is not to go to the world with values and say you need to live up to these values. I mean, the church has been given the task of proclaiming him, Colossians 1:28. Him we proclaim. So we have a person to bring to the world. What I want to do is a kind of a judo move when the critique of the church comes our way, to simply say, well, by what standard? And kind of the image that I had with me throughout writing the book was Matthew chapter 13, which is fascinating. It starts off with the parable of the sower, and the seed gets sown, and the first opposition to the seed is the birds that peck at it. And Jesus describes that as like satanic opposition. Okay. The next time you see birds, though, is right at the end of Matthew 13, when the smallest seed, the mustard seed, has grown the largest plant, so large that even the birds perch in its branches. And that's fascinating to me. You know, the last time we saw birds, they were opponents of the word of the kingdom. And now they are depending upon that kingdom. Now they are held up by that kingdom. Now they are enfolded to some degree within that kingdom. And I think whenever we see critiques of the church, I think that's the first thing I want to sort of say to people. Where do you get the idea that we ought to be compassionate? Because it's, you know, nature is red in tooth and claw, and nature says it's the survival of the fittest and the sacrifice of the weakest. Christ comes, and he is the fittest who is sacrificed for we the weakest, so that we can be, included in his kingdom. That is the reversal of the way of nature, and that is the birth of compassion. Without that, we are left with the natural realm. And the realm of biology is a brutal realm in which it's dog eat dog and the weak go to the wall. What world do you want to live with? So you might call the church cruel. Okay, why is compassion such a chief value that you want to press into? Let's press into that more.
Yeah, because they don't have any basis for it outside of Christianity.
I mean, they might say, let's just be pro-social. And that you get an evolutionary advantage from being pro-social, but being pro-social is usually you draw the circle around your clan pretty tightly, and you're pro-social towards them. That's not generally the sort of compassion that people have in mind when they accuse the church, for instance, of not being compassionate. Mm-hmm. So where do we get that from? Yeah.
Now, one of the eras of history that you talk about is the medieval era, and the Dark Ages, as it can be known, and we don't usually know too much about what happened in there. But what I thought was interesting as you talked through the medieval era is another thought that I had while I was reading your whole book, which was, yes, I agree, all these virtues that we assume are right come from Christianity.
It's therefore no surprise that Marcus' were.
That's all right, and it's fascinating to see them unfold. But there's also institutions that we think are so right. You know, everyone should. I was reading the Education Act in Australia the other day, and they say the state's duty is to ensure that every child receives a high education. And I'm going, well, what? Why? Schools weren't your idea. And you bring out a whole bunch of those institutions as well in the medieval era. Can you talk to some of the progress that Christianity made in the medieval era?
Yeah, and I think John Dixon has written brilliantly about this in Bullies and Saints, but lots of non-Christians are kind of noticing this as well. Powers and Thrones by Dan Jones is just a sort of an immense work about the medieval period. Or The Light Ages is a rip-roaring read by Seb Falk, and just trying to overturn that caricature of the medieval times being dark ages. No, they were light ages, and so you can think of some of the. You can think of some of the horrors of the medieval times. Charlemagne was a warlord who became the Holy Roman Emperor in 800, and his path towards victory included the slaughter of his enemies and forced conversions at times. He beheaded thousands of those who, refused conversion to Christianity. And that's precisely the sort of thing that people think of when they think of the Dark Ages. But what's fascinating is that Alcuin of York, this scholar, basically takes on the emperor, writes this letter to him and tries to persuade him about persuasion. And he proves persuasive. And Charlemagne kind of puts away the sword and begins the Carolingian Renaissance, which, people, when they think of the Renaissance, they think of 13th, 14th century in Italy. But actually, the Franks had a Renaissance, 400 years earlier. In terms of a real return to cathedral schools that taught the classical education, and even nowadays you can do a classical Christian education, and the curriculum involves 7 different topics that all sort of lead towards theology, but it's not, they weren't just teaching Bible stories. They were teaching rhetoric and logic, and they were teaching numbers and arithmetic and astronomy and music, and they were building people who were soldiers, not in the way that Charlemagne had first imagined, but soldiers who truly understand that the sword of the Spirit is the word of God. And if you really take that image seriously, then you want to raise up armies, but you want to raise up armies that are good with words, with arguments, with disputations, with logic, with reason. And therefore, where the Romans, built their armies, medieval Christendom started to build its schools, and it started off with cathedral schools, and then, starting in the 11th and 12th, by the 12th century, you have at least 4, universities. You've got Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, where else? Paris. And then by the next century, you've suddenly got thousands of university students, and it's a gift to the world, universities, and what was right at the heart of those universities was something like the motto for Oxford, which is "God is my guiding light." And yes, they were sort of they were kind of seminaries for monks and priests, yes, but they did not simply teach theology. They did not simply teach Bible studies, biblical studies. They taught ancient philosophers. So all the ancient learning that humanists today want to say, we need to get back to that ancient, humanistic learning. We need to sort of leapfrog over the church and go back to the Platos and the Aristotles and the Ciceros. Well, the reason why we have the Platos and the Aristotles and the Ciceros is because they were absolutely prized and studied and copied by monk after monk after monk down through the years. And so that real belief in enlightenment, that's usually a phrase that's used of sort of 18th century and following. But I deliberately called my chapter about the medieval times Enlightenment, because I think our belief in enlightenment goes back much, much further than that.
Now, that leads really well into another thing that your book made me think of, because C.S. Lewis, in his book The Abolition of Man, he talks about how in education, as he observes it back in the 40s, they were removing the concept of virtue from the way they were teaching kids, and so they were training kids to have to have heads and hands, but no hearts.
Yes, men without chests.
Men without chests. That's right. Remove the function, demand the virtue. Castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it just struck me that I was having a conversation with my neighbour the other day, and he was bemoaning the way the world was going. He's not a Christian. He's got Christian background, Catholicism, and some Christian cults in there. So he sort of understands Christian values, and he's looking at the world going, this is all terrible. But he had no answer. He didn't know what to do about it. And I think we can, as the church, we can sort of feel the same way. We see these virtues as a good thing, and it's great that, as you illustrate in your book, that they're so well received in society. But then the question comes, well, what do we do about the fact that all the foundations have been removed? And so I was wondering, as you studied through history of how these virtues became ingrained in our culture, what was it that put them there? Obviously, that's not necessarily the goal. We don't just want virtue, but what should we be doing about the degradation of our culture around us?
I think what we're seeing in universities, for instance, is a continuation of the fact that we believe that virtue should be at the heart of education. It's just our notions of what virtue entails now has changed, and it's thinned, and it's become very shrill. and you get the social justice warrior kind of caricature going on. And so I still think that universities are trying to form people in virtue. It's just that the virtues have been detached from the Christian story and distorted and re-weaponized against the church and are not particularly healthy. So what is the answer to that? It's got to be a return to the original. And I was at great pains at the end of the book to say, listen, my argument is not the world has inherited Christian-ish values, therefore the church should be world-ish. It's the very opposite. I don't think the church should be world-ish, even if sometimes the world is a bit Christian-ish. Christianity should keep doing its weird thing. It's very distinctive, weird thing. And I kind of finish with Matthew chapter 5 and just saying, look, Jesus has no anxiety about the success of his movement. He had no anxiety 2,000 years ago. He still has no anxiety today about the success of his movement. He just wishes we would be distinct. We are the light of the world. We're a city on a hill. We're salt that is to keep its distinctive saltiness. And that is how the church has made its difference. Light shines. It goes out from itself to bless that which is not like it with what its nature truly is. And salt, if it's going to keep meat from going off, it spreads. It's good. He uses analogies of yeast working through the dough. But it's got to be distinctive. It's got to be different to what the world is like. And when you look back at the great dramatic changes that Christianity has made, in the early centuries, martyrdom, for instance. I mean, talk about going against the grain. There is lots of great scholarship on how did we break out of the fatalism of the Greek mind. In the Greek mind, if you go and watch a play, it's going to probably be a tragedy, and everything is going to unfold with a kind of a relentless cruelty. And it's a cruelty that was predicted probably in Act 1. And by Act 5, it's happened, and the dead are everywhere, and there's nothing he could have done about it. And the Greek mind was very much like that. And what is it that's broken us out of that? Well, Christian theology, yes. But the Christian practice of people saying, you can take my life and I will go joyfully, yielding it. And I will take control even of that worst calamity, death, and use it towards a greater end that is greater than death. And Christians can go proclaim the resurrection of the dead. But when the Greeks and the Romans saw Christians gladly giving up their lives for Jesus with confidence and hope, it made them see a different way to be. And actually, freedom was birthed, and the idea of freedom was birthed in two things, really: martyrs and virgins. Because virgins were really weird in the ancient world. That was your one shot at immortality. How are you going to have a future? Well, in your offspring, and so you don't want to be a dead end. You need to have children, and yet Christians voluntarily taking on virginity.
I think you're right in the book. There's no Latin word for a male virgin.
There's no Latin word for a male virgin. And there's 25 words for a prostitute, right? And that's the sexual culture into which Christians are being really weird.
Yeah.
And when we think of the sexual revolution, we think of the 1960s. Well, 1900 years earlier was the real sexual revolution that was for the blessing of the world. And it really was for the blessing of the world. And the equalization of the sexes all came out of the Jesus's sexual revolution. And so Christians were being really weird about like their lives and yielding up their lives even to death. They were being really weird about the state. They sort of brought civil disobedience into the world, and they were still honoring the authorities, but saying, "Oh, but you can take my life. That's fine," and taking on their losing well in John Dixon's kind of phrase, which is sort of an understatement, and he knows it's an understatement. But the virginity, the sexual revolution, the fact that all civilizations practiced infanticide, like all of them. You would expose usually a little girl because they were less valuable in those societies, and you would expose the disabled and you would let them die on the rubbish heaps. It was the Christians that toured the rubbish heaps to save the children, raise them in orphanages, and then legislation catches up with what Christians were doing. And hundreds of years later, there was legislation that said you must raise the children that you give birth to. And so legislation caught up with the Christian Revolution, but the Christian Revolution first and foremost was preached and it was lived out. And it was just weird. You know, Christians would go into the middle of the arena. There was one monk called Telemachus who went into the middle of the arena to stop a gladiatorial fight between two gladiators. They didn't know what to do because there's this monk sort of on the arena, and the crowd stoned the guy to death. Right? But that martyrdom changed the minds of the crowd. Word got to the emperor. The emperor decided to ban blood sports. Like, how did blood sports get banned? Yes, legislation was involved, but first it was Christians preaching and then living out a totally countercultural way. And it wasn't popular. So my argument is absolutely, you know, don't be like the world in order, you know, to get the world to be like us. Be weird. Be like salt.
Are there any areas you see that particularly needed today?
The sexual revolution.
I was thinking.
Yeah. Well, the sexual revolution of the 1960s is kind of the mirror image of the sexual revolution of the first century. In the sexual revolution of the first century, essentially, there was no Latin word for a male virgin. And the sexual double standard was emphatic and was not apologized for. That's just the way things were. Jesus says, no more double standard. Men must be just as chaste as women. Men must be just as restricted as women are. And that brought an incredible equality. And if you want to see the effect of that equality, it's a big fat book by Joseph Henrich called The Weirdest People in the World. And he's talking about the sexual revolution of the first century. The Jesus revolution built your world. And it's written by a evolutionary biologist, not a Christian. It's a fascinating read. The sexual revolution of the 1960s is the reverse of that. If the first century said men must be as restricted as women, because of the pill, in the 1960s, we just started to say women can be as liberated as men, let's say. And therefore, what do we get? We've had the unpicking of 1900 years of the goodness of the Jesus revolution. I think in so many ways, and contraception has broken the link between sex and pregnancy. Abortion breaks the link between pregnancy and children. Easy divorce breaks the link between mother and father, and the family is just being blown apart. And yeah, I think it's been the biggest assault on the way of Jesus in 2,000 years. What would it mean? What would it mean to stand against it? What would it mean to live out the goodness of the Jesus revolution in the midst of this kind of society? And I think it means singleness and marriage being prized in our churches. I think it means a pro-life movement, a pro-marriage movement, and a pro-singleness movement, which is a combination that doesn't go together really just in politics, which is why, the church needs to sort of be different to the political culture clashes. But it needs, because a church that really values singleness and really values pro-life is going to be really messy, because now we're going to raise every single child that's born to us, and they're going to come from all different kind of walks of life. And there'll be people who, for lots of different reasons, marriage is not right for them, but they need to be prized and included in the life of church. And we can't just be a 1950s kind of conservative little ghetto. To actually embrace the sexual revolution of Jesus means to live out these really weird communities that I think the world will look on, and they will think, on the one hand, they look incredibly right-wing because they're so pro-life and all that. And on the other hand, they might look very left-wing because they're this sort of commune of people like living together in bonds of love that cross all kinds of boundaries. But I think the revolution of Jesus' sexual, the Jesus sexual revolution lived out today will be the weirdest thing to the culture, but I think also the most life-giving thing. And I think an instantiation of what it means to follow Jesus. So I would urge us to redouble our efforts to do that.
And that's great, Glenn. And thank you for that. And I hope that people are encouraged to pick up your book and find out all the other areas that they should think about in terms of how the Jesus revolution, as you term it, has shaped the world we live in and should continue to shape it. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your book.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
No worries. And you've been listening to the Reformers Bookcast. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time.